I'm very excited to introduce and welcome our final session of the day. So we have an exciting set of speakers and panel discussion lined up on scaling AI implementation for real-world impact. And with that, I'd like to welcome our moderator for this session, Michael Pfeffer, who is a clinical professor of medicine and a chief information officer and associate dean here at Stanford. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. As you heard, my name is Mike Pfeffer. I'll be your human in the loop for this session about scaling AI implementation for real-world impact. And you're gonna absolutely love this session. I'd like to invite up our speakers / panelists come up on stage. We'll introduce our speakers as they're gonna come up and talk to you about some of the amazing things they're doing. I do want to answer the question from the last panel about who's responsible for AI. It's me. As a chief information officer, I'm responsible for whatever we put in the system, so that we didn't need that panel. But no, anyway, we have a great session for you here, and I'm going to get right to it. Our first speaker today is Dr. Julia Adler-Milstein, and Julia is just absolutely amazing. If I read her bio, we'd be here for the next hour, so I'm going to be very brief. Julia is the professor of medicine and chief of the division of the Clinical Informatics and Digital Transformation and director of the Center for Clinical Informatics and Improvement Research. So please welcome Julia to tell us about scaling AI implementation for real-world impact insights from UCSF. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me today. Us San Franciscans need to come down here for our vitamin D dose. So it's been nice to be down here. I think I can now retreat to our foggy city for at least another week or two. I'm really thrilled to be part of today, and in particular to be part of this session. I think the subtitle of this session could be Frameworks Meet Reality. Because the frameworks are critically important, but I think what we are finding is that what you are facing on the front lines of AI governance and decision making are really, really hard decisions that feel like they have no right answers. And so I want to give you sort of that deeper dive to complement the prior panel to show you what this looks like as we are evaluating AI tools and trying to make decisions about whether they are ready for real-world clinical settings. So I think these will be familiar themes at this point in today, but we seek as a health system to be a national leader in the use of trustworthy AI at scale, and to really be sure that we are approaching that in a problem-oriented way, where we're really solving today's pain point on the front lines of care. And so the two pieces to really emphasize is AI at scale. We are, I think, like many health systems, feeling a little bit of pilot fatigue, right? An AI tool that does this very niche little thing in this one little clinical area. We will not harness the power of AI if we continue to pilot it to death. And so we're really trying to identify where are there opportunities to bring in AI tools that will work at scale. And then how do we ensure trustworthiness? Again, we've talked about that a lot today. We're using some of the same frameworks, but we have to operationalize those frameworks, actually figure out what are the measures that tell us whether a model is trustworthy or not, and then what are the values of those measures that tell us this is above or below a certain trustworthiness threshold. So it gets very real very quickly as we're trying to implement this. As we are working, we're trying to stay very conscientious of this framework, which is a general framework for innovation that really thinks about how do you simultaneously keep in mind 3 innovation horizons at once. So first, how do you innovate around the solutions that you have today, right? So in this model, that's gasoline-powered cars. How do you look sort of in the near future, a year or two out, and be able to innovate around the things that are coming or are already starting to take root? And then how do we also at the same time look at the far, far horizon and say, what is care going to look like in 5 or even 7 years? And how do we start preparing today for what those tools need to look like in 5 to 7 years? And so in the AI context, this is where we are today. We're thinking a lot about AI for operations. I'd say most of our deployed models today are very focused around operational use cases. But we're starting to see that sort of second horizon where we're deploying generative AI for augmenting clinical intelligence in different ways. And then we're trying to think to that third frontier. And what does this look like when we are ready for fully AI-driven virtual care, right? Entire cycles where we can start to take the human out of the loop, or at least start to take the human out of part of the loop. For example, symptom recognition and then assessing a first set of tests, diagnostic tests. Maybe in the near future, we're not going to need a human for that part. So at the point the patient shows up for the visit, we actually have a much richer set of data for the clinician to make the decision with. So I think it's just, again, important as we're talking about what this looks like from a health systems perspective to realize that we're trying to manage these three horizons all at once. Our team, I think any team to do this work has to be diverse and bring in different disciplines and sets of expertise. And so what you see here is that really at the heart of it is our Chief Health AI Officer, which is an emerging role at health systems that are the folks who are sitting at the center of this, standing up AI governance, and are really the people who are thinking about whether tools are ready for clinical deployment. And that group is supported by a range of health system functions. So you can see our health IT team, that's the health IT team that runs our clinical systems and our health system. Our chief data officer, who's thinking a lot about data readiness for AI. Obviously, infrastructure and security is a key piece of this. And then you have the more sort of researchy folks, both the sort of more fundamental data science scientists, as well as people who are in my new division, who are more the applied clinical informatics folks, who understand how to study how tools work in real world settings. As we've understood the infrastructure we need to be able to deploy AI at scale, we have evolved from vendor-deployed platforms, in our case, like many others, using Epic, and realized that there were shortcomings in the vendor tool that we saw, and so we've built our own AI platform that we call HiPAC, that has, I'd say, a set of functions that allow us to deploy a broad set of AI models at scale integrated into our electronic health record. So the predictions or whatever is coming out of those tools can get fed directly into the EHR and clinical workflows. Where are we today? Again, it may sound like we have millions of models. Like the reality is we're still really early on in this, right? So really only a handful of models that are deployed and a broader set in the pipeline. It's really a mix of models that are coming from our vendor that we've vetted and models that we have homegrown, so to speak, that are either coming from our health system data scientists or from researchers. We also have Versa, which is our platform for generative AI integration, again, integrated with our broader AI platform, and right now supports different instances of GPT-4, but is designed to be able to support a broad set of LLMs. As you think about what are the major pain points in healthcare that we think are lend themselves to, in particular, generative AI solutions, this is sort of our top list. And within each of these, we are currently evaluating very specific use cases for LLM. So for clinical documentation, we're doing a pilot with a set of different scribe vendors, like I suspect many other health systems are today, for diagnostic assistance, piloting different approaches for triaging high-risk patients and images. And you can see down the list these different use cases. Again, I think many health systems are developing this on their own. And as was described in the last panel, it's really an opportunity, I think, for collaboration. Like, what is the curriculum and training you're providing to your frontline clinicians versus ours? I think a lot of this still feels like we're doing it on our own in a silo, and there's so much opportunity for collaboration and sharing. We are also, I'd say, monitoring the policy space here, and we're really taken aback in some ways when the California Attorney General asked us, well, how are you monitoring racial and ethnic bias in your algorithms? And we said, well, not only are we not doing that yet, we don't even know the full set of algorithms we have deployed in our EHR. And so we had to really start from a basic understanding of how do we even track and inventory our AI solutions and then build up to an enterprise strategy for monitoring and assessment. So now we do feel much more ready to be able to respond to a regulation that asks us about what we are doing to monitor at scale. But I have to say that even a couple years ago, I think we were nowhere near ready for this. We have adopted the HHS trustworthy AI guidelines. So as tools come through our AI governance process, we are assessing them for each of these dimensions. Again, the framework part is nice, and I can show you a pretty picture of it, but we have to think about what are the measures that fall into each of these? How do we decide for a given model what value counts as meeting that criteria? And those are decisions that, again, right now we're just doing by committee consensus. Very hard to know if we're making the right decisions or not. So again, that's where I think this concept of framework meets reality feels like it gets very complicated very quickly. So what does our AI governance committee do? First of all, it's unified. So all models, whether they come from our vendor, whether they come from our main EHR vendor, a third-party vendor, a researcher, the health system, they all go through the same AI governance process. That is truly a committee that meets every few weeks, and we review all the models, regardless of where they are. Are they just coming in as an initial concept? Are we doing retrospective validation, prospective validation? Are they actually deployed and we're then monitoring and assessing whether they're performing to our standards? So that's a committee that has, as you can see, different skill sets represented, and are trying to determine whether our models are safe at the get-go and then continue to be safe and effective once they're deployed. This is hard work, the effective governance. First of all, just the backlog of embedded tools, right, to take everything through a committee that then has to review retrospectively, prospectively on an ongoing basis. It's a lot of just people hours. And so I think we're just trying to resource up to be able to have the governance we need at scale. It feels to us kind of like an IRB. And so we are trying to think about, like, is that the model that we should be using for AI governance is more of an IRB type model. And as we get new types of tools that come through, just when we think we have the perfect intake form, we're like, okay, well, that intake form doesn't work now for this kind of model. So we're constantly trying to sort of evolve the AI governance process as new models come through. And we're also trying to work with all the groups that you've heard about today to understand what frameworks they're developing, how health systems are implementing those frameworks, so that we can stay in tune with the best practices and adapt what we're doing to what we're seeing emerge around us. And then this is my final slide, which is the piece that I will say I am like most passionate about, which is the monitoring piece. And how do we think about assessing what models look like over time once they're deployed, right? So if we see models drift, like what level of drift is concerning? Do we need to have someone 24/7 that's staffed to monitor our models, and if they drift too far overnight, be able to pull the kill switch, right? These are the real decisions that we're having to make about how to do monitoring of systems that are in real world use. And then we need to think about how do we monitor the workflow that's happening around the models, right? Humans in some ways are even harder to monitor than models. And we're seeing our humans do all sorts of things we didn't expect with the outputs of our models. And so what is the modeling framework we need around humans? And then we talked about this whole notion today already of like clinician vigilance. And if we are expecting our clinicians to be that final checker to make sure that something is safe or effective, how do we ensure that they are doing a good job of that? And so I think we're trying to think creatively about the strategies that can help ensure that our clinicians are as vigilant as they can be, at least in the interim, until we move to a point where I hope that we're not going to continue to expect that of humans, because I don't think it's really what humans are good at. So I hope this has been a helpful deep dive, and look forward to the next set of presentations and questions.
Great. Thank you, Julia. That was really fantastic and a really great real-world view of what's it like on the ground to actually bring this stuff into production. Our next speaker, Dr. Patricia Garcia. Patty is well known here at Stanford as the Associate Chief Medical Information Officer for Ambulatory Care, where she also serves an Associate Professor in Gastroenterology. Again, if I read all of this, we'll be here all day. So, Patty, I'd like to have you talk about early clinical use of generative AI, perspectives from the Oregon Trail. I love that. Remember the Oregon Trail? I guess.
If you don't, you'll see some
Yeah, I
screen
guess
shots.
we're too old for that. Okay.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to jump right into this whirlwind tour of two recent real-world generative AI deployments that we did at Stanford, as well as what keeps us up at night. So I'll start the story with the launch of ChatGPT in November of 2022. So 6 months later, Stanford was live with AI-generated draft responses to patient inbox messages, which I think is a testament not only to the speed of AI evolution, but also to the urgent need to improve burden and burnout. After a few rounds of prompt engineering and beta testing, we initiated a pilot of ART, which stands for Augmented Response Technology in Epic Speak, with a total of about 200 physicians, APPs, pharmacists, and nurses in primary care and gastroenterology. That didn't look good. No. There we go. Here's a mock user interface. At the top is the patient message, followed by the AI-generated draft response. Users can click Start with Draft, which will convert the draft into editable text that they can use as a base for their reply, or they can click Start Blank Reply, or they can choose any other action, including ignoring the draft entirely. Complete details from our pilot can be found in this JAMA Network open paper that was published in March, but for now, here are a few highlights. So the first outcome we looked at was draft utilization, which we defined as the percent of time that clinicians replied to a patient and clicked Start with Draft. You can see highlighted in purple that the average draft utilization was around 20%. Given minimal clinician education and that these responses were created by a large language model without any domain-specific training, we found 20% to be remarkable. We then performed subgroup analyses looking for differences between the 3 different roles and the 2 specialties involved in the pilot. We identified significant variability in utilization from a low of around 10% in primary care nurses to a high of around 45% in clinical pharmacists. Within group differences were even more striking. So here we plot the utilization of individual clinicians as points on the scatter plot. The top row represents gastroenterology, while the bottom row represents primary care. And the different columns are physicians and APPs on the left, pharmacists in the middle, and nurses on the right. And the y-axis is utilization from 0 to 100%. You can see here that there were some users who didn't use a single draft message throughout the pilot. But there was also another subgroup of users, primarily GI physicians like myself in the top left, who had 100% utilization. And when we talked to them, they told us that they primarily interface with patients through their nurses, but every now and then they would see a draft that was so good that, as my co-first author, Dr. Stephen Ma, would say, they chose to take all the credit and send it right to the patient. Nope. The next thing we looked at was time. We looked at time in a number of different ways, but here we'll focus on the total time spent replying to messages, which we defined as the time between when the physicians last viewed the message to when the message was sent. The mean difference between the pre-pilot and pilot periods was an increase of 11 seconds, which wasn't statistically significant. Pivoting away from EHR use measures and turning our attention to the subjective clinician experience, we measured cognitive burden using a modified version of the NASA Task Load Index, which consisted of the 4 questions shown here. Users were asked to reflect on their experiences responding to patient messages and assign a score between 0 and 100 for each question, with lower scores being better. We identified a statistically significant reduction in burden across our users that was present in primary care and gastroenterology on subgroup analysis. We then measured burnout using the work exhaustion inventory from the Stanford Professional Fulfillment Index, which consisted of the 4 questions shown here. Users were asked to assign a score between 0 and 4 for each question, again with lower scores being better. And again, we identified a statistically significant reduction in burnout across our users, which was also present in both primary care and gastroenterology on subgroup analysis. Finally, to contextualize our findings, we utilized qualitative research methods to identify common themes and sentiments in the free text responses of the survey. Highlighted here are 2 areas, which are draft tone and draft relevance, where the perspectives were split. Some folks felt like the tool was appropriately professional, while others felt like it was too formal. Some folks highlighted how well the draft addressed the patient's questions, while others noted that they could be way off. These comments emphasize not only the heterogeneity in LLM outputs, but also in people's preferences and practices. I'm now going to switch gears to talk about our pilot of an ambient digital scribe called DAX Copilot, and I thought that this actual draft response was a perfect segue. Here, a patient asks their doctor about DAX and leave it to GPT-4 to generate a marketing-worthy response. It says, DAX records our conversation during the visit and then generates a draft of the visit note. I then review this draft for accuracy and make any necessary corrections. This technology helps to ensure that our discussions are accurately documented while also allowing me to spend more time focusing on you. Here's what that looks like in practice. Clinicians use Epic Haiku on their iPhone to record the visit, and a draft note is returned directly into the EMR in what are termed smart sections. There are smart sections for history of present illness, physical exam, results, and assessment and plan that can be integrated with existing note templates. And this content usually returns within a few seconds of concluding the recording. We invited a total of 76 physicians from both primary care and several medical and surgical specialties to participate. It took us a little bit of time to create a stable cohort, but today we've operationalized the solution for 50 physicians across 11 specialties. The next few slides show some preliminary data. The overall utilization across all encounters was 50%, which is shown here in yellow on the left. Looking at the individual smart sections, you can see higher utilization of the history and assessment and plan smart sections, which are the green and blue, and much less use of the results and physical exam sections in purple and red. But similar to the draft inbox responses, there was significant heterogeneity between individual clinicians, with utilization ranging from 0 to 100%, which suggests that, again, there's still a fit for these tools in their current version. This graph shows the change in the average time spent writing notes from the pre-pilot period to the pilot period in minutes. The dotted red line represents no change. Dots above the line is time spent, and dots below the line is time saved. So you can see that the majority of individuals fall below the line and therefore save time using DAX, although the amount of time saved was pretty small. This slide summarizes a lot of our preliminary qualitative results. You can see that most clinicians felt that DAX was easy to learn how to use. They could see themselves using it long term, and that they felt that they saved an average of 12 minutes per half day. That said, the net promoter was 6.25, which certainly suggests room for improvement, and again, likely heterogeneity and fit. Using the same burden and burnout inventories from the ART pilot, we saw a 35% reduction in burden and a 26% reduction in burnout. So what's next? Just last month, we expanded ART across enterprise primary care, which represents a little over 350 clinicians. In terms of DAX, thanks to some impressive negotiating from our technology team, we've entered into an enterprise license with Microsoft Nuance and are in the midst of planning the approach to scaling this across our 2,000 users. So as we think about this enterprise expansion, there are a number of topics that keep us up at night. At the local level, there are things like fit, note quality, patient perspectives, and cost. One level up from there are concerns about responsible AI like automation bias, automating biases, de-skilling, and the regulatory landscape. And at the highest level, there's the big question about whether this is going to be more like Short Circuit's Number 5 is Alive or Skynet. Of course, my generation of folks is used to adapting to rapid technological changes. We grew up with landlines and Amazon as a rainforest, and then we had to adapt when the internet and smartphones became ubiquitous. They also grew up worrying about cholera and dysentery and whether we could have enough oxygen to survive the Oregon Trail. So we're ready to take on the challenges of an AI-enabled era. One of the things that keeps us up at night is cost. This is the Gartner Generative AI use case prism for healthcare, which gives ART lower feasibility and value than ambient scribes due to less potential to improve revenue and burnout and less technical maturity and readiness for adoption. That said, ART is also a lot less expensive in a time where healthcare operating margins are really tight. ART may have other costs, though. For example, will these drafts help us write such quick, insightful, empathetic responses that will actually encourage even more patient messages? Will we move even more unreimbursed work to the in-basket? And what about this idea of having a human in the loop? If AI can summarize the chart, take a history chatbot style, generate a note, suggest orders, suggest diagnoses, suggest billing codes, and it can do all that 24/7 without fatigue, without burnout, and at a fraction of the cost of a human, that's going to be paradigm shifting. Finally, what about de-skilling? I'm not a DAX user, mostly because writing notes is part of how I think. And if I had more time and I didn't have to think about billing and legal issues, I'd actually enjoy writing notes. Could it be that actively writing a note helps us think more than editing a note that's been written for us? And even though we know that too much burden is bad, is too little burden bad too? If our trainees grow up in an era where they never have to write a clinic note, will they have lost a critical skill? Will they be happier? Of course, we're not the first sector to face these questions. Autopilot in the airline industry, and more recently, autonomous vehicles have surfaced a lot of these questions. And let's not forget about this. Goodbye Abacus, goodbye long division, and hello TI-82 graphing calculator. Or better yet, this. Goodbye paper charts, hello EMR. In the end, I think very few folks would want to go back to paper charts, and I'm sure when we look back, very few folks will want to go back to pre-AI healthcare. That said, we're in the pioneering phase of this transition and haven't yet had years and decades to optimize our systems and workflows. So it's important that we think about these anticipated issues and prepare to face unanticipated issues so that we can see this and not that. I will end by highlighting the team of folks that makes this work possible. It really does take a village. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Patty. I still have yet to beat the Oregon Trail game, so I don't know if you've been able to finish that, but it's really fantastic kind of taking us on the journey of what it looks like to really deploy these things in production. So our final speaker, Dr. Kimberly McManus, welcome back to Stanford. Kimberly is currently the Deputy CTO of AI at the Department of Veteran Affairs, leading VA's agency-wide AI roadmap and implementation. Her expertise is at the nexus of software engineering, artificial intelligence, and digital health. Before the VA, she built ML and AI products in the industry at 23andMe and LinkedIn and various other startups. Welcome, and Kimberly will be talking about operationalizing AI at the Department of Veteran Affairs.
Hi, everyone. So I thought I would start with when we're talking about the scale of AI, what do we really mean about scale and how does that fit in with VA? So I'm operating from the vantage point of central VA, so we look across all of the Veterans Health Administration as well as our other functions such as benefits and memorials. And VA is a big place. By many measures, we're the largest integrated health system in the United States. We have over 1,200 medical facilities. We employ over 120,000 clinicians. About 1 in every 1,000 adult Americans is a VA employee. So this all makes for a pretty large, complex ecosystem that I think is ripe with opportunities to implement AI to improve outcomes and make positive impact if we do it well. Similar to many health systems, over the past decade or so, we've integrated a handful of AI devices and tooling. But about 8 months ago, we started an agency-wide initiative to really think deeply about how we'll go about operationalizing AI across the whole organization. Our initiative has 4 main components. So the first one is AI governance, which we've heard a lot about today. The second is workforce development. Third is our priority use cases, and 4 is infrastructure. In the AI governance workstream, we've, similar to other health organizations, we're really focused on how we can continue to foster the innovation that we see really across the whole organization at local sites across the country and the great diversity of ideas that our end users are coming up with. And how do we provide the right guardrails to enable them to do that in a responsible and trustworthy way? At VA, we've set up a high-level AI governance council that's chaired by VA leadership and has membership from all of the major end organizations, as well as groups like privacy, cybersecurity, data ethics, et cetera. And the role of this body is to create and approve things like our AI strategy, our roadmap, and how we think about reviewing and monitoring AI use cases on the ground level. One thing that's different about VA from most other health systems is that we're also a federal agency, and the federal government has put out a variety of requirements and policy specific to federal agencies that is supposed to be implemented this year. And so components of that is 1, a public AI use case inventory. So last year we did this as well. We have a 2023 inventory published about a year ago that lists all of our operational AI use cases at VA. That inventory is online now. It has about 128 use cases in it, and 40 of them are listed as in operations. We're in the process of creating our next version of the inventory. We expect it to be much bigger, and it contains more than just what the use case is, but a wide range of information about each one. And so I'm hopeful that this will be a very good resource, both internal to our organization to help us collaborate, because we're seeing a lot of people really excited about similar ideas, as well as external to communicate to not only veterans, but other folks like you on what VA is up to and how it might make sense to get involved. The other thing is we have specific requirements to be implemented by the end of this year for things like high-risk AI. So we are required to review all of our AI use cases. One of the definitions of high-risk AI is anything that has a significant impact on clinical care, which is most of what we've been talking about here. Those include fully reviewing the AI use case, ensuring that we have monitoring set up for things like discrimination, and we're mitigating that. And similar to what we've been talking about here, really defining what it means to monitor and mitigate discrimination is something we're actively at work on as well. And then third, we have internal policy and guidance, such as a trustworthy AI framework that we have also put out, internal guidance around generative AI, et cetera. Second work stream, which I'll be brief on, is AI workforce development with a workforce of over 400,000 employees. This is a huge challenge and opportunity. It's huge change management operation here. So we've set up an AI at VA community where we have thousands of interested people joining our forums to ask questions and engage with each other. We've set up communities of practices. We've put out trainings for not just AI experts, but we're noticing that it's really touching all of our employees across all functions. And so how do we ensure that really everyone has that baseline knowledge of AI? And then third, hiring, looking across the whole organization and identifying what are the areas that new expertise is needed in. The third work stream we have is AI priority use cases. And so, as I mentioned, we have a little bit of AI in production today. This is mostly a few risk prediction models, so particularly one around suicide risk and another on opioid overdose risk, which are part of comprehensive care programs that have been at the VA for the past decade or so. We also have some around understanding feedback and surveys, and then medical devices, particularly in gastroenterology and radiology. For our kind of focus areas, we've looked at what is AI pretty good at and what are VA's top priorities. And so similar to what we've heard, I think decreasing healthcare worker burnout is a really high priority for us, as well as overall improving the veteran and staff experience. I think there's a lot of, as we've heard, administrative tasks that can be streamlined potentially, and that all fits into this category. And then just overall better care for patients. Some pilots that we're either currently running or just getting started are the ambient AI scribes that seem to be a very popular test for everyone. And we're learning for many of you in the audience actively. Two is external document integration into the EHR. So at VA, we have a lot of documents, and in particular, we have documents from care in the community. So we have 1,200 sites, but veterans also go get care from other organizations, and oftentimes that data comes back to us in a format that's very hard for us to process, often in PDFs. And so streamlining the integration of that back into our EHR. Additional models to triage high-risk patients. We also have our own on-network generative AI chat and document interface that we've gotten really positive qualitative feedback on, that it's been improving productivity and reducing time, et cetera, as well as some software code completion tools that we're testing. Last category is AI infrastructure. So how are we actually going to get out all of these tools across VA? And so that has kind of three layers for us. First is an enterprise data platform. So ours is called Summit. It takes in data from all of our EHRs, because we're on multiple different systems and different sites, into one location, updates most of that data daily, has a lot of the modern tooling, et cetera. And then two, machine learning specific infrastructure. So we've developed infrastructure specific for example, natural language processing and clinical text processing. We had this project recently where we set up a whole pipeline to get all of that data in a single place and to make it a lot easier to go from initial research and R&D to actually deploying products and testing them in production in a safe way. And then third, the applications that we actually use to interact with the end users. So for example, they could be integrated directly into our EHR, or we have developed a clinical decision support platform that sits on top of that, as well as a few other tools. And that is the overview of how we're thinking about AI at VA. Thanks all.
Thank you, Kimberly. Really incredible view of what you're doing at the VA, and of course the scale is just massive, so that's really impressive. What I've learned so far is we have to name our data science platform at Stanford because we call it platform, so that's not very creative. I want to also introduce Dr. Daniel Yang joining our panel as well. Daniel is the Vice President of Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technologies for Kaiser Permanente. In that role, Dr. Yang is responsible for ensuring quality oversight for all AI applications across the organization, including those used in clinical operations, research, education, and related administrative functions. So what I'm going to do is I have one question for the panel because I'm sure you have lots of questions about the amazing three presentations you just heard. So based on your experiences in implementing AI in the real-world setting, what are you most excited about in terms of AI transforming healthcare in the next 2 years? Who would? Okay, Daniel. Thanks.
All right. I'm actually excited about more studies that we just saw from Patty. Just real-world implementation experiences describing how these tools work in actual practice. Are they effective? Are they safe? Are there hallucinations? Are the expected benefits being realized in terms of time saving, physician satisfaction, right? So generative AI is a new environment for all of us. I think we're all kind of learning as we go. But it's also very inefficient because we're also learning in silos. And so, you know, we had a lot of questions, for example, when we were exploring various generative AI tools, including ambient scribes, inbox management. And it kind of felt like we were running a clinical trial within our organization, doing quality assurance on the fly, asking a lot of questions, asking the vendor a lot of questions, trying to parse through what they were saying back to us and whether we trusted their answers or not. And so, you know, I think there really is a role for the research community. I'm hungry for the types of evaluations that you've published, that we are publishing at Kaiser Permanente. I think if we are going to really deploy these tools for impact, we need to demonstrate that there is impact. And so I'm excited to see more of that, and I'm glad to see that there are early examples in that space.
Thank you, Daniel. Patty, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, or at least for me, to think about the 2-year time horizon. I think if we were talking about 10 years, we might not even recognize the way medicine will be then. But in 2 years, for me, it's more about the pebbles in our shoes, like prior auth. You know, if I never have to do another prior auth again, that will dramatically improve my happiness, right? Even if it doesn't save me time, right? And I think that's what we're seeing some of these, right? Just improving burden and burnout isn't all about time. It's some of those little things. Or, you know, extracting ICD-10 codes or billing or just making scheduling more efficient. You know, the things that we know that honestly these language models do well, it's the low-hanging fruit, but I think that those will happen within the next 2 years and really make a big difference.
Thank you. Kimberly, what are you excited about in the next 2 years?
Yeah, I agree. I think we've seen in other fields that there's been a lot of time savings and quality of work increases, particularly in customer support and writing, et cetera. And I think seeing more studies like we just saw from Patty, I'm very excited for. And I think there's a lot of potential, particularly in the administrative space. I'm also hopeful that we'll start to develop this culture of rigorous piloting and monitoring. I think it's the thing we're all talking about now and we're seeing the beginning of. But it's hard, and it takes resources, and it takes time. And I'm very hopeful that we'll all continue to invest in that and really develop that as the standard.
Thank you. Julia.
Yeah, I'm really torn between two, so maybe if I do two quickly. I think
Sure.
the first is that clinical reasoning has really been a black box in many ways. And I'm excited because I think generative AI tools will force clinicians to start to reveal in ways that we can capture how they are reasoning. And I think as we better understand clinical reasoning, we're going to have so much better opportunity to design tools that better support it. In some ways, we're trying to design AI tools around a phenomenon that we don't really understand and have a deep science around. So I'm just very excited about that as a transformative opportunity. The second piece that Kim alluded to is around interoperability. And I think we have spent the past decade building solutions that move patient records around. And I think now the information is by and large at the point of care, but our clinicians are hopelessly impaired at being able to sort through it and find all of the information that's relevant to a given clinical encounter or decision. So I'm really excited about the combination of interoperability and AI to be able to bring a full picture of patient information to the point of care.
That's fantastic. Questions from the audience. We have microphones. Do we have any questions? Okay. Do we have some online questions too? Okay, we do. All right.
So one of the online questions is, how does UCSF interact with FDA regarding evaluation of medical devices enabled AI? And there is another question, to what degree are you involving bioethicists, psychologists, patient advocate, and similar professionals in the decision-making process about governance?
Okay, so the first one was about medical devices and how you interface with the FDA, particularly at UCSF. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes. So I'm not sure I have total insight on the device side, and so I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer on behalf of all of UCSF. I mean, I think we are paying close attention to what is getting FDA approval, the whole SAMD process. We actually got an AI tool through the FDA clearance process, and it's now integrated into GE X-ray machines to detect pneumothorax. So I don't know if that's a complete answer to the question, but I think we're trying to both be in sync in terms of what is coming out of the FDA, but specifically on the device side, I don't know that we don't have a separate sort of whole AI governance framework for that, if that was the question. And then the second question was?
Multidisciplinary
yes.
teams to really look at how you do this deployment.
Yes, I mean, I think we are trying to bring together the full set of disciplines that we think we need that are available at UCSF. Again, I don't know that there is a defined best practice there for what that looks like. I think we could do more on the patient engagement piece. And again, we have a lot of different PFACs, but we're like, which one is the PFAC that's best structured? Do we need a different PFAC that's just for AI? So I think, to my mind, that still feels like a work in progress in terms of making sure we have all the right people at the table. But we did try to start as broad as we could.
And just to kind of dovetail on the FDA question, because we talked about this yesterday at the Race Health Symposium, how important workflow is in the algorithms, and it's really hard to say approve software as a medical device in particularly AI when the workflow of what to do with that could determine or will determine the outcomes. And I'm curious your thoughts about simply having it FDA approved doesn't really get us all the way there. What do you all think about that?
I would just agree with the statement. I was just on a call today. We were reviewing or talking about an AI use case around it was a kind of agent assist. So KP is also a health plan, and so we've got a lot of member service agents. So this was a use case around providing feedback on the agent, so quality assurance testing on a call service agent. And the question that we were exploring is, well, one, you can look at the actual algorithm itself. It's using generative AI, it's taking the transcript, it's kind of doing a lot of what you're doing with ambient scribe, but then it's assigning some sort of score. So obviously you want to know what's going into that score. But then there's the question, well, what do you do with that score, right? Because if I said everyone under a certain threshold gets fired, I mean, that's going to raise some red flags, right? I mean, I'm sure our lawyers would be concerned. I'm sure, we're probably breaking some laws if we did that. And so it's not just the algorithm, in isolation. You really have to understand the entire workflow, right? Because it's very different if you said, oh, well, we're going to take that and provide feedback to our call service agents to identify areas of opportunities, to really, pinpoint ways that they could have said something more succinctly. We're going to provide transparency on the fact that we're using this tool and how it works, right? So you can imagine those scenarios are very different, and yet the technology could be exactly the same.
Thank you. That's a great answer.
Hey, my name is David. I'm an incoming radiation oncology resident here at Stanford. I have a question for Dr. Garcia. First of all, that was a phenomenal talk. Thank you for that. My question is, part one is, are you at liberty to disclose what kind of models you use in the DAX/ART thing? And part two of that is, with new models being announced 2 days ago, how do you adapt? Do you just plug in the new one off the shelf, or do you do fine tuning or?
Yeah. So for ART, or for the augmented response, it was GPT-4. So we started off with GPT 3.5, and it really wasn't scalable. And then when we moved to 4, we felt like it was in our beta tester group. For DAX, DAX Copilot is a Microsoft Nuance company. So they have their own proprietary algorithms that they use to help generate the notes that we don't know the details of, and they use GPT-4 in the background, although not in real time. That could change in the future. In terms of our ability to influence the models, for DAX, not really. For ART, we are the prompt engineers right now. And I think that could be its own talk, and we've certainly learned a lot about prompt engineering for the last couple of months and years. But we do have a little bit more control there.
Oh, and then part two being with new models being announced, GPT-4o, like 2 days ago.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really good question. Like, one of the things that I think about a lot is, like, are these pilots that we're doing obsolete the moment that we publish them, right? Like, Sam Altman's out there saying that, like, GPT-4 is the worst AI model we'll ever remember in history, right? And so when GPT-5 comes out, it will just blow it out of the water. And so what we have learned with this model, will it matter, right? Will the phenotypes that we've identified matter? Will there even be a phenotype anymore? I mean, I think it's a really good question. It's moving so quickly. You know, I think it's really hard to take these learnings that are slow and operationalize these things that we want to do quickly when it's evolving so fast. So I don't think I have the right answer, but it's something we think about a lot.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a great question. Curious if any other panelists have thought about this in governance. You know, with the more traditional AI models, we have a little bit more control. Here's the model. Okay, we're going to make some changes. We go through change control. But with generative AI, these things are changing all the time, let alone it's hard to monitor them. How do you decide when you're going to bring a new model through? Does that go through governance? How are you thinking about that?
I mean, I think the honest answer is we haven't gotten there yet. We haven't had that need, and I think it's going to be really hard because, as you said, the key piece is that they're very hard to monitor. I think if we could monitor them, we would probably just put the new version into practice and then just do the very vigilant on the monitoring part, but I think it's the lack of monitoring that will probably force us to go through a full revalidation, which, again, just from a resource perspective, feels quite daunting.
Thank you. Daniel, yeah.
I mean, one, I hope the vendors are monitoring, you know, and they're letting us know. So we're not doing it ourselves. Me too. Yeah. So, you know, I would try to put that on them as much as possible. But two is, you know, there was a concept raised where do you want to just have benchmark data sets? You know, so if it's ambient scribes, you just have a set of clinical notes that you just run every 6 months, you know, and you kind of see if it continues to be performant and reliable. And so I think there might be, you know, ways of trying to, as a community, kind of check these tools over time.
Thank you. We've got a lot of questions here. Ron, we don't have time for your question. I'm sorry.
Well, it's good you say that because I'm cheating a bit. This is actually the question I was going to ask the previous panel, but actually I think this might be a better panel to ask the question. Anyway, Ron Lee from Stanford, physician here at Stanford. So my question is actually more on kind of the education and training involved in making this scalable for the workforce. So just thinking about, you know, as a user of not just AI, but just regular health IT, the regular old health IT and EHRs, and implementing and evaluating those types of things. I mean, Patty, you mentioned even things like automation bias, which is a concept that comes from very old, you know, studies of CDS that predates AI. And also just like even being on the wards and talking to physicians who are thinking about like discharge processes, like all of these things tend to converge into what sounds like is needed to create these AI products and evaluate them truly at scale in the sense that it actually applies to practice at a high level. So going back to my question, which is education and training, like I help lead our clinical informatics fellowship here, and we think a lot about how do you actually, like, what is the curriculum that's needed to train our physicians who actually want to be involved in these technologies. And the obvious component would be, of course, training in AI and data science, which we do. But there's quality improvement, there's just regular health IT, there's all this other stuff that seems to, you know, still be pretty relevant. And I think we have a hard time thinking about how do you integrate all of that into this, you know, this burning platform. So just curious if you guys have any thoughts.
You know, I think it's a good point. I think, you know, I'll say when I think about educating and training folks, for me, it's like, how do you educate and train folks who are going to be using these? I think one of the things that we've seen so far is that they're really intuitive tools that folks can use without a lot of education. I think that's good. I hope it continues to be that way. I think the backside, though, is what you're talking about. Like, how do we know how to evaluate it? What defines safety? What defines quality? You ask 5 different docs to respond to a patient message, you're going to get 5 different responses. It's not just the accuracy and the error rate. And I think that's where we do need a lot of different folks to come to the table. But I think it's hard to know how to integrate all the different people who are interested and knowledgeable. And then that's taking aside, that's just talking about clinicians, right? Like, what about the ethicists and the lawyers and the, you know, the advocates to the FDA? And like, how do we all come together so we're moving this forward without just completely annihilating the timeline, right? Which will take too long if we're all taking too long to have these discussions. So.
maybe I'll just add briefly, like I do think it's important that our clinical informatics fellows are trained in just the fundamentals of like clinical decision support. I mean, so many of the issues we're facing now are just the same issues of alert fatigue. And so it's like if they don't have those fundamentals, I don't think they'll be ready for how to think about some of the AI challenges. Yet AI is also offering new challenges, and so I think we do have to integrate that. And I think we don't see a lot of like formal curriculum there, and so what we're doing is like we're pulling them into our AI governance committee, or we're pulling them onto actual projects, because I think honestly that learning on the front lines is like the best opportunity right now for the people who want to have careers in this to be able to see, you know, the real issues that we're facing. I just feel like a classroom is not going to be the right way to train for that.
Daniel, thoughts?
You know, this is actually an idea from Stephen Lin, one of your colleagues, which is, you know, when we talk about ongoing monitoring, like who's doing the monitoring? Like, are we going to, you know, I think Nigam mentioned, are we going to just create a new workforce to do this monitoring? And the concept that Stephen brought up is, well, why don't we just repurpose our quality and safety professionals, right? Our implementation scientists. Like the tools are new, but the functions of, you know, reviewing cases and, you know, adjudicating whether something wrong happened, I mean, those are part and parcel. Every healthcare system across America has that function. And so I think that we should be, you know, retraining, leveraging existing resources we have, applying existing frameworks and that we have, and just, you know, change from CDS to AI. So I don't think we need a new workforce per se. I think that we can use the existing expertise we have to extend to cover this as well.
And Kimberly, you talked a lot about thinking about educating, you know, VA staff. Curious your thoughts on what Ron was asking.
Yeah, I think thinking about the whole organization, we take a lot of different approaches. So for educating the whole staff, we're trying to think how can we get out training very broadly, and so that has to be pretty low effort that people will want to engage in and that we have the resources to actually create. And so some of the ways are just putting out actual training and classes, and then other ways are we have an on-network ChatGPT basically interface and providing options for people to a little like training course, et cetera, to understand how to use that and kind of where and when that type of technology can or can't be used is something that I think can be really helpful as well. And then similarly, really just experiencing on projects, I think is the most helpful thing, and really getting people engaged on the pilots and projects that we've been working on.
Thank you. Okay, next, please.
Hi, all. Thank you for sharing perspective. So my name's Julia. I'm a master's in clinical informatics management student here, non-physician, kind of an engineering design product background. And continuing this analogy of clinical trials in 3 phases, something I've been thinking about is organizational barriers to adoption of implementing AI in these real-world settings. And I think it was Julia who started with the analogy around frameworks to reality, something there. And so if the 3 phases were technical implementation, and the integration, the workflow adoption risk, and then like business and ROI with some early results from a pilot, how would you all think about your leadership to kind of, what are your leadership approaches to bringing your teams through these organizational barriers of adoption?
Leadership and change management.
Yeah, that.
Yeah, it's a great question.
I mean, you know, I feel like there's the pre-ChatGPT answer and the post. So I've been, you know, in clinical AI and diagnostic AI, and for a long time you talk to clinicians about diagnostic AI, and they look at you with a lot of skepticism and kind of feel threatened by it, and there was a lot of just internal resistance. And so, I mean, that's where the resistance were. It's just that providers or users didn't want to use these tools. They didn't think it was truly useful for them. And then particularly with a lot of these tools focused on provider burnout, I mean, suddenly the level of excitement, engagement, enthusiasm for these tools were like tremendous. I mean, like people wanted these tools yesterday. And so, I mean, if anything, it wasn't, you know, institutional barriers. It was like, how do we stand up institutional barriers, you know, to really think through this before we deploy it too quickly? You know, so I think a lot of it is really just driven by demand, and I've seen an incredible increase in demand in some of these Gen AI tools, especially as related to these, you know, the rock in your shoe, so to speak.
Sure.
Other thoughts? How do you get these things to get to our clinicians?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say we had a new health system CEO who joined a couple years ago, and what he said to us was like, I don't even want to hear about it until you have 50 clinical champions. And I do think that like clinical champions are a really key stakeholder here, and I'll be honest, like they are skeptical. They're coming off a decade plus of technology that hasn't done what they wanted, and many of them would say like has made their life harder. And so I think that is a really useful benchmark, but I totally agree with what Daniel said, which is like they've been converted very quickly. Like I think as soon as they play around with these tools and see how powerful they are, like it doesn't take much. So while at first we thought, oh my God, like 50 sounds hard, now it doesn't sound nearly as hard as I thought it was when I first heard it.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi. So you guys represent 4 very large medical systems, and the 2 models that I've seen for implementing AI in healthcare is either using like large incumbent vendors or making like bespoke AI systems within your network. Do you see any other ways of implementing AI tools, either like sharing AI models across networks or using smaller vendors, startups, or or because it seems like very limiting if you just either go with Epic or try if you're a large network trying to build something in-house.
Great question. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are, I'd say, maybe I didn't represent totally, like I think we are, there is a natural bias towards Epic tools because they come with some of the integration. And so that does reduce some of the cost and complexity, but we are also working with third-party vendors. I mean, I think it is really hard to kind of have like the company in the garage come to us. I think we've had a lot of experiences with that not going well, but I think there are many third-party vendors, especially in the ambient scribe world, that many of us are working with that have shown pretty quickly out of the gate that they have brought products that can scale and are viable. So I wouldn't say that it feels like the ecosystem is wide open and anyone who has a good idea will be able to seamlessly integrate with our large health systems. But I do think that again, with our framework, we are able to work with like a set of broader vendor partners than perhaps we had in the past.
Yeah, I would agree. VA is not on Epic, so we're mostly still on CPRS as well as partially on Cerner. And so we do work with a wide range of third-party vendors as well as in-house. I expect that over 90% of the AI that we integrate probably will be from a type of third-party vendor, though the full range from smaller to larger ones, and then a little bit of in-house as well.
I would just say from the vantage point of KP, I mean, like the VA, we're a large system, and so we have high expectations of our vendors, right? We kind of ride them hard. We deploy across many hospitals, clinical care sites, right? And so just the level of maturity from the vendor needs to be pretty high. Our technical risk office, like AKA data security and cybersecurity, undergoes very, very rigorous review for all of our vendors as well. But on the flip side, we have a strong preference to go for vendors, right? Why build something in-house when you have a mature, validated solution that you can just buy off the shelf? I think our expertise is really around implementation at scale, right? So kind of developing the workflows around these new tools, which I think is a really important skill. We'd rather be, I think I heard it earlier, AI-enabled in the sense of really being able to take those tools and maximize value out of it. But I also think that there are a few spaces where we can bring kind of KP's unique know-how, our data sets, our integrated care and coverage model. And I think that there may be spaces where we don't expect the market to solve solutions that are specific to KP and that are really existential for our business model. Those are areas where we would, I wouldn't even say look to build in-house, but look to partner to build. Where we can bring the clinical expertise, the data expertise that we have, and hopefully find the AI expertise to kind of partner with. But we would be very selective around those.
I'll just say one thing on this because I love that question about third-party vendors and how we think about this. If you think about a platform approach, and you've heard that we all have kind of data science platforms, AI platforms, and then platforms such as EHRs where we can incorporate these things. So part of it is, we are using a lot of kind of commercial off-the-shelf products to define those platforms, which can then ingest models or other kinds of AI from third parties or de novo. Models themselves and bringing them into platforms is actually pretty easy. It's the workflow that ends up being really, really hard. But it's so important from a cyber standpoint that we get this right. And on top of that, startup companies are often bought by then other companies, which then make it very difficult for us to continue using them. They're often not kept up or they're sunsetted. And so we waste a lot of time sometimes dealing in that space. So we kind of need to be a little bit choosy. Final thing I'll say, and what I'm really excited about, is if you take an audio transcription, or audio recording of a clinic visit, and you use just an off-the-shelf API to transcribe it, and then you put it in GPT-4 and say, create a note, it's pretty good. So think about piecing together off-the-shelf technologies of AI, models, whatever, to build together the solutions that you're going to need. So I think that's really, really exciting, and it's going to allow us to do things without having to create things from de novo, but really piecing them together to create the solution we want.
Thank you.
Sure. Hey, David.
Hi, Mike. Hi, everyone. Great presentation. David Larson from Stanford in radiology. So while I'm listening to this, I'm thinking about something that is, I think, fundamentally implied but hasn't really been specifically addressed, and that is the shift in basically work and effort and focus from episodic, primarily on the episode, like the interface of the clinician or whatever provider and the patient, to increasingly into the infrastructure, the programs, and the literally sometimes the infrastructure, everything that goes behind it. And that, we saw that shift, when we had in radiology, it was PACS, and across EMR, we already had a shift. We're now seeing another wave of that, especially when you look at the programs that have to accompany all of these applications. So now I'm going to ask a very maybe boring and painful question, but how did your internal, what are the internal mechanisms, budgeting mechanisms and finance mechanisms? How do you cope with that, where you're now moving things, that were operational, for example, into capital, right? Where you're now having to think about, what you've got, something that provides value to the physicians, but it's the health system that has to provide it. And it goes, that's not generally what they're in the business of doing, right? So what are your mechanisms to help deal with this strain? Are you feeling the strain? And if so, how are you helping to navigate it?
You stumped the panel. Thoughts? It's a great question.
I mean, I would just, I don't have an answer, but, it is a big question. Who pays for it, So KP is a health plan and a care delivery system, and there's kind of questions for ambient scribe. Is it the medical group paying for it? Is it the health plan paying for it? Who recoups the benefits of it? And you might imagine if it's a medical group, they're really focused on physician wellness. If it's a health plan, you might be focused on access to care, right? So who's paying for it also kind of determines what you're optimizing it for. So I'd say it's an open-ended question. The way that I view AI and what I would maybe bring to our chief financial officer is, are there non-clinical AI use cases that are actually cost savings? Where if you gave me $20 million, I'm going to give you $40 million back. And they're not going to be clinical AI use cases. They're going to be things like, very simple things like, translating member letters into different languages that we currently pay a third-party interpreter service to do, right? So can you give me an internal kind of AI venture fund within Kaiser Permanente? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go find any use case that'll give me $2 for every dollar I put in. But that's a conversation I need to have. So, I'm practicing it now. But
you're doing it quite well, actually.
Well, so I don't think that there are, I think the existing flows of dollars are where you'd go for, So in KP, it's like the regional investment committees or the care delivery investment committees, et cetera. I don't think we've reorganized our funds in ways that really allow us to deploy resources to really high-value opportunities in AI, where the person paying for it may not necessarily be the same person that is directly benefiting from it.
I mean, we've just started these conversations and they're hard. I think at the start, there's sort of a like health system contributes some, our faculty practice is going to contribute some, is my guess is where this is going to land. And then they're going to want to see the data on who it's benefiting. And then I think then it's sort of the longer run question of what that means in terms of who's going to pay in the long run. I think up front, we're seeing a little bit of willingness to kind of share the burden and then understand what the real value and ROI is.
Should be the Department of Radiology that pays for most of this, right? I'll just say I think it's also use case dependent, and really looking at having a framework to determine what the value is of each of the things you're putting in. At Stanford, our governance group actually has funding capability, so we actually can bring kind of our firm assessment, which is how we kind of go through the framework on assessing our models. It goes all the way through utility, and then finally, what is the cost and return on investment for the particular thing that we would like to deploy. And that committee has funding capabilities to not only approve the solution, but also fund it. Big picture, some things are going to lose money, but are the right things for patients. Some things are going to generate revenue. You pay $20 million, you get $40 million back, great investment. Together, the entire AI portfolio has to be positive or you'll go out of business. So I think that is kind of how I think we need to think about this in terms of how an academic medical center or large organization thinks about their portfolio, because not everything is going to fit neatly, but all in all, it should provide value to the organization. Yeah, great question. All right, we have time for one more question.
Hello. So my question is along the lines of rapid evolution of technology, and it's not just like evolution, but the advent of new technology as well. I think one of Matt's slides showed earlier today that how just like a few months ago we thought that answering some of those questions were not going to be in the near future, but then OpenAI came and solved all of them. So, I mean, we were looking at CNNs and RNNs recently, and then now nobody's looking at them. They're looking at vision transformers and BERTs to solve imaging and language problems. So this shift in technology is happening rapidly, and sure, some of them will be building on old technology, but there might be just new technology. So the question is AI implementation going to be able to keep up in order to have real world impact? And how do you see the process of scaling it possible? Especially in larger organizations like you represent here?
Any thoughts?
I can try. I think the question is, as technology is rapidly increasing, it's just going to keep getting better. So how do you know when to invest in something if the next best thing is going to come tomorrow and blow it out of the water? Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's why thinking about the things that we do invest in, ensuring that whatever metrics we're judging success by are worthwhile to us. We know that the testing and evaluation that we have to do for the model that exists today and the one that exists tomorrow is a lot. And so even if the model tomorrow is way better in some way, the amount of testing and evaluation would still take a lot of time. And so for us, I think it's looking across what all other health systems are doing and what we're seeing in the literature, particularly outside of healthcare, and figuring out, is now the right time to invest in that particular use case, and does it drive the particular metrics or outcomes enough for us to do that, knowing that tomorrow a thing could be better, and we've chosen to do this thing.
Well, thank you all. I was not a good human in the loop because I know we are 10 minutes over. But this was really a wonderful panel. Please thank my panelists and speakers here today. Thank you. And I think we're going to have some closing remarks before we have a nice reception afterwards. So,
right, Serena, what a day.
What a day.
I'm curious to hear what your impressions were, but before that, I would really like to thank 3 colleagues who made all of this possible. It's Joanna Kim, Michelle Fang, and where's she? Jacqueline Thomas. Maybe she's outside. If you hear us, Jacqueline, come in. Thank you so much for helping us prepare all of this. Hey, Jacqueline. Thank you so much for telling me what to do and for doing so gently. I think it was such a great event. Everything was flawless. So please join me in thanking.
Okay, just echoing Sergio, huge thank you to Joanna, Jacqueline, and Michelle. Well, I think this is the end of the day, and so I hope you've enjoyed this as much as we have. I think we've really covered a wide array of topics today. I think a lot of the critical topics in the field, from generative AI, both the landscape now and in the future, to a deeper dive into clinical use cases that are really at the forefront of AI in healthcare that's being deployed, and looking at systems-wide scaling of AI implementation. We also had great panels, very I think insightful discussions around AI in healthcare from an industry perspectives, as well as around responsible AI. So I think this gives us a lot of food for thought, I hope, to I think inform a lot of our own work and next steps forward. And well, we look forward to hopefully seeing many of you all at the symposium next year again. And now we have a networking reception for everybody. So thank you, everyone.